Atoms in the vacuum were the beginning of the universe. The atomic universe. In context. Key figure Democritus, circa 460 to circa 370 BCE. Before, circa 475 BCE, the Greek philosopher Leucippus develops the first theory of atomism, the idea that everything is composed of indivisible elements. After, circa 11th century CE, the Islamic philosopher Al-Ghazali writes of atoms as the only perpetual material things in existence. 1758. Croatian polymath Roger Boskovic publishes the first general mathematical theory of atomism. The idea that all matter is made of atoms has a very long history. It began in the 5th century before Christ with the Greek philosopher Democritus. He drew on the work of his near contemporary Anaxagoras, who believed that the matter was definitely indivisible, and of his teacher Leucippus, who suggested that all matter consists of an infinite number of indivisibly small indivisible particles. For the small too was infinite. Anaxagoras, Early Greek Philosophy, 5th century BCE. The real atomos. Democritus knew that if you cut a stone in half, each half had the same properties as the original stone. He reasoned that if you kept on dividing the stone, eventually the pieces would be so tiny that it would be physically impossible to divide them any further. He defined these infinitesimally small pieces of matter with the word atomos, meaning indivisible, from which we derive the word atoms. He suggested that atoms were eternal and could not be destroyed. However, they were constantly combining and recombining into different substances. These atoms were solid with no internal structure. They were all the same matter, but of different sizes, weights, and shapes. Each material came from a specific form of atom. The atoms of a stone were unique to it and distinct from the atoms of a feather, for example. The nature of a material resulted from the shape of the atoms from which it was formed and the way those atoms joined together. For example, iron atoms were jagged and locked together, while water atoms were smooth and rolled over each other. Democritus's universe. In Democritus's thought, the universe had existed and would exist forever. Its structures arose through random movements of atoms which collided to form larger bodies and worlds. These collisions set up motions or vortices that differentiated atoms by mass. The world was governed by the nature of atoms, their motion, and the way they were packed together. This was an attempt to apply mathematical laws to nature, since the atom's behavior was governed by mathematics. For Democritus, nature was a machine. Democritus arrived at his views by deduction rather than experiment. Other philosophers, particularly Aristotle, did not agree with them. Aristotle, following Empedocles, maintained that everything in the universe was made up of fire, earth, air, and water. In addition, Aristotle criticized the idea that atomic motion had always happened and that there was no beginning to it. Later developments. In the 4th century before Christ, the Greek philosopher Epicurus upheld the atomic theory. However, in an attempt to argue against the concept of Democritus's mechanical deterministic universe and defend a notion of free will, Epicurus maintained that atoms moving through space might actually swerve from their otherwise predetermined paths, adding an element of chance and thus giving rise to the new chain of events. The Roman philosopher Lucretius in the 1st century BC wrote in On the Nature of Things that the matter was composed of first beginnings of things, tiny particles perpetually moving at very high speed. The atomic theory, like much of ancient Greek thinking, was forgotten in Europe for centuries until it was rediscovered in Arabic translations of Aristotle, who attacked it. Aristotle's theory of the four elements as eternal principle prevailed over the atomic theory, which Christian scholars regarded as too materialistic and thus contrary to their teachings. The concept of atoms was eventually revisited by Enlightenment philosophers in the 18th century and evolved into the atomic theory of British chemist John Dalton in the early 19th century. Democritus. Known as the laughing philosopher for his cheerful, lighthearted look on life, Democritus was born around 460 BC, possibly in Abdera in the Greek province of Thrace, or perhaps Miletus, which is now in western Turkey. Little is known of his life, and none of his writings have survived. His thought is passed down in fragments, mainly through a monograph by Aristotle and anecdotes related by the Greek biographer Diogenes Laertius in the 3rd century CE. Democritus is said to have traveled widely, almost certainly to Egypt and Iran, and possibly to Ethiopia and India as well, meeting scholars in these countries. He also toured Greece to speak with natural philosophers. Leucippus of Miletus became his mentor and had a great influence on his thinking, sharing his theory of atomism with him. The circumstances of Democritus' death are unclear. He is said to have lived to the age of 90, which puts his death around 370 BCE, although some writers claim that he lived to 109 years of age.